And we are live, back with another Boxing Squared live stream. Wherever you are in the world, morning, noon or night, I thank you for joining me. And this live stream, we're going to talk about the postponement, Fury Wilder 3. It's off, so to be rescheduled because COVID-19 has struck the Fury camp. So Fury himself apparently has symptoms. There's reporting that suggests Joseph Parker, who's been in camp, also the likes of Andy Lee, who's Fury's assistant trainer, trains Joseph Parker. Apparently he has it, and some others. But I mean, regardless of who has it, the fight isn't going to be happening on July the 24th, and it's boxing. We cannot have nice things. Hence the title of, or the thumbnail, I should say, we cannot have nice things. This was effectively the only big fight on the horizon for a couple of months. So, and I don't just mean the top of the bill, I mean the card in general. We have, you know, a couple of really good undercard fights on there. Robert Helenius versus Adam Kovnarski, F.I.A. Jugba versus Frank Sanchez. So that is now going to be off as well. Remains to be seen if some of those fights will be sort of farmed out to other cards, but it's not happening July the 24th at least. So disappointing from that front. And I see someone there saying allegedly he's got COVID. So Lee says that. And actually when the news first emerged, so I was getting ready for work, so it was, you know, before 6 a.m. here in New Zealand, and just as I was getting on the bus, I saw the news basically saying a postponement was possible. And the first thing that I thought was, this is just some psychological tactic. It's a wind-up from Fury and his camp, the fight's going ahead. But then within a couple of hours, it was off entirely, postponed till potentially October. So, yeah, so initially I just sort of thought, well, this might just be something to get into the Wilder camp's head and sort of suggest it's not going to happen, try destabilize them. But apparently, you know, it is true. The fight has been postponed. I guess we have to expect some of this. I mean, I think we've actually been relatively lucky that a lot of main events and cards in general have gone ahead in these pandemic times. Since boxing started back after a 3 months absence at the start of the pandemic, we really haven't had too many big fights cancelled because of COVID-19. But here we are. And I guess you're in a situation where, I mean, COVID is sort of not really being checked as much in the United States at the moment. People are getting vaccinated. They're relying on that. Things are opening back up. It's trying to deal with this on an ongoing basis, that this thing is here to stay. We just have to manage it. So I guess we had to expect that eventually something was going to bite us in terms of the boxing fandom, that fights would be cancelled. But there's a whole bunch of, I guess, flow-on effects from this, because I've seen suggestion, should Dillian White fight Deontay Wilder? I just can't actually say. I know that they're putting that forward as a suggestion, but given that Fury and Wilder are contracted, you've just had this messy arbitration end a little while ago, hence this third fight being back on. I guess we're just going to have it. I don't see there being any interim fights for either. They would have to both teams in the WBC agree to that. I don't see the WBC ordering any fights in the meantime. But yeah, it's disappointing, because when you look at the calendar, the schedule, there's not much on. There was that card, which was really sort of the big card in July. I mean, this weekend, it's a ghost town almost in the heavyweight division. Some lower level fights, some prospects on the way up who'll be fighting, but nothing of substance, no real meat or sort of 50-50s or anything approaching that. So, we've got a couple of lean weeks, and then it was going to be a big card. And obviously the Joe Joyce card in the United Kingdom was going to sort of be the sort of lead into that fight on July the 24th. So that's still happening though. So Joe Joyce versus Carlos Takam. But that's kind of, it's not the same sort of level of event, or even the same sort of level of fight. You've got a faded Carlos Takam. He'll come and give it a good go, good effort, but Joe Joyce should be good enough to beat him. But I'll get to the chat here. So you've got IMPK saying hello from the USA, hello from New Zealand. The Flying Pan Man says good morning. Christopher says yo. As I mentioned, Lee said allegedly. Sandeep says Porky's Corner called it. Well, there was a number of people who were saying that this event wasn't going to happen, but generally it was the other way around, that it was going to be Deontay Wilder pulling out. Those were the sorts of comments that I was seeing online, and people dropping comments saying, log it, this event isn't going to go ahead, Wilder's going to pull out. So yeah, I mean, it's disappointing. I mean, I guess some people will look at this through the lens of Was Tyson Fury sort of coasting into this fight? Was he really focused? Is this some sort of, the conspiracy theorists, there's some sort of ploy to destabilize the Wilder camp, push it out? Because Deontay Wilder has been solely focused on this fight for this date and training accordingly. Very intense. We've seen what they've been trying to do. Can he maintain that sort of focus for another few months? Is this going to lead to some sort of situation of overtraining? Because there had been a number of people sort of commenting on the Fury side that Fury didn't necessarily look in the sort of maybe fight-ready condition that people were expecting. But it's always hard to tell with Tyson Fury because he can say a number of things in public and be a bit of a jokester, but be dialed in at the same point. But a delay of a few months, I mean, who's that going to benefit? Will it benefit Fury? Will it benefit Wilder? Will Wilder end up overtraining? Or does this give him more time to actually, work on those technical adjustments that he needs to? So IMPK says, Boxing Squared, did you see Hearn is floating the idea of Wilder fighting White? Well, he's been floating that for a few years without luck, so I can't see that happening, as I alluded to a moment ago. Jay says, the heavyweight division is a rotting corpse that means scavenged by animals. Yeah, there was actually a tweet. It was Minimax Boxing had tweeted something about the heavyweight division being dead and fights either not announced or cancelled or people not fighting each other or not confirmed anything. And it was a very good point because it's kind of like the heavyweight division is sort of on this sort of, that spinning wheel of death that you get for computers where it's just sort of loading and nothing much is happening and you're waiting and you're waiting. It kind of feels a little bit like that. And I'd said a couple of months ago, what was it, in May or something like that, that we'd really had nothing much in the first 5 months of the year. You had Dillian White knocking out the corpse of Alexander Povetkin. You had Joseph Parker underwhelming against Derek Chisora. But apart from that, there really hadn't been too many fights of note. Obviously, we saw Mahmoud Shah put Christopher Lovejoy out. And at the start of the year, we got to see Trevor Bryan after 2.5 years of absence. So Ross says FFS. I'll let you decipher that one. Fish says WBC should put Luke in recess and let Wilder and White duke it out. They've had no sanctioning fees for nearly 2 years. They must be getting twitchy. See, I can't see them doing that because, everything with the arbitration, the sort of legal side of things, they've agreed that there is a fight, there's a contract. If the WBC tries to get involved, they'll get taken to court. I think it's kind of that simple. Ryan says, why is it a 13-week delay though? Well, it's probably related to COVID-19. I mean, if Fury has it, which we're hearing that he might, that could, take some sort of toll, and he may have to have a period of recovery. It's not like he'll sort of be going back into training next week. I think the 3-month delay is probably, you could sort of say, is that long enough? I mean, we don't know the long-term effects for some of these fighters with COVID, so I mean, I don't know all the details, how badly he's affected. I mean, some of the reporting has either contradicted itself or been a little bit light on detail. But all we know is the fight's not happening. They're talking about 3 or 4 months down the line. So it is what it is at this point. And it's disappointing because the undercard was so good too. So it was an event for heavyweight boxing fans to savor. It wasn't just, some intrigue with the main event. Was Tyson Fury either going to smash Deontay Wilder again or Wilder somehow find, a means to victory? You had some good 50-50 type fights on the undercard and a good showcase for Jared Anderson, which we will probably now be waiting until, whenever it's going to happen again. They're talking October. I've seen various dates. So Lee says Wilder's team will not take a White fight. No, I don't think Deontay Wilder, while he's got this rematch, this third fight with Tyson Fury, will be entertaining that anyway. And I'm not sure the WBC would, as I mentioned a moment ago. So Interpal says, who should fight Hergovic next? Well, that's a good question. They've been working down the IBF rankings, did a video on that the other day. We will have to see, but I wanted to focus more on the Fury Wilder stuff in this video, so I'll just move on here with the chat. So Davey says, do you think this and anything to do with ticket sales? Well, that's the thing. I mean, I haven't actually seen where ticket sales were at. I mean, you could possibly say that it does, but if they had a couple of months to build this fight up and the tickets weren't shifting, what's to say that another couple of months is going to do too much more for it? Because it is one of these sort of, and I was saying in the build-up, and I know that there were some hardcore Deontay Wilder fans, saying that this was going to be doing even more tickets and it was going to do more pay-per-view buys. Just all in all, I think it's a harder sell than the second fight. The first fight with the intrigue, the knockdowns, Fury getting up, and, the controversy around that, the controversy around the scorecards, it set the second fight up nicely. But having Deontay Wilder battered in the rematch, it makes it harder to sell this third fight. I mean, obviously, I think as it's got closer, I think boxing fans, with some of the changes that seemingly Deontay Wilder's been willing to make, made a change in his head coach in terms of Malik Scott taking over. You actually saw him doing different boxing training that would, for years, heard that he didn't really like to do, and we'd seen different sort of clips where he's actually, working to the body and working on stuff that he may look to implement in a fight rather than just looking for a right hand. So I think people were like, okay, well, if he can do even a little bit of this, maybe he'll have more success and be more competitive. And I think as the fight got closer, a lot of us were like getting more interested. Okay, what's going to happen here? Still thinking that Fury might still, be the firm favorite here, but maybe Deontay Wilder would put up a better effort than the second fight, which he needed to. And he's always dangerous anyway with that right hand. And with the undercard, I was looking forward to this event overall. So it is disappointing. So I'll get back to the chat here. I'm not sure where I was at. Oh yeah, getting back to that question, is it about ticket sales? Well, that sort of falls into that sort of, conspiracy sort of angle, but maybe there's something to it. I mean, we've seen different fights before get pushed back because ticket sales weren't good, but I'm not sure it was ever going to be a sellout anyway. Jack says, I'm getting fed up with boxing. Yeah, like I say in the title, we can't have nice things. And this month is pretty dry overall. Christopher says, I find it infuriating that folks aren't taking the news at face value. Well, I'm taking it for what it is. I mean, you have COVID that is rampant in the United States. They're vaccinating people, but they are treating it as a situation that they're living with the virus to some extent, and people, different cities are opening all the way back up now. To me, this sort of stuff is just going to happen, and I'm surprised we haven't had more of it in terms of cancelled fights. So BG says, hello Boxing Squared, hello to you too. Toppentine says, is this live or a recorded live? How do you mean recorded live? So I'm reading your comment, that's live. You've just wrote it, a minute or two ago. It is definitely live. And actually, I think this is only part of the reason for doing this live was, as I was mentioning at the top of the stream, I was getting ready for work at the time, this may be postponed. So I couldn't get to anything. And then throughout the day, yesterday, obviously, I was working all day, got home, I was pretty exhausted. It was Friday night, and from the weight of the week, I was just like, I haven't got any energy to do any videos. Because, you might spend 2 hours or an hour and a half and, gathering, researching, recording, editing, and then uploading all the bits and pieces that you have to do. And it might be a 7 or 10 minute video. So it's, it ends up being quite time consuming. And I'd kind of missed the boat because I'd been at work with the whole news. So I figured, well, I haven't got any energy last night to do anything. I will go live today and we can talk about all this sort of stuff, toss it back and forward about different bits and pieces. But this is a live stream, not a recorded live. I'm not sure if people actually do those things, but I can tell you I'm interacting with you. We're 13 minutes, almost 14 minutes into it. 58 in the building. Wherever you are, morning, noon or night, I do thank you for joining another Boxing Squared live stream. But it's a disappointing situation, obviously. And the rest of the month is looking lean. You got Joe Joyce, and then in early August, Fabio Wardley. And we don't have fights for Andy Ruiz, Luis Ortiz confirmed. We don't have the Joshua Usyk fight confirmed yet, although they're talking September the 25th, which is a couple of months away. So it's been a pretty lean year so far, and the run continues. Phil says, who really wants to see Fury vs. Wilder 3? Well, I did. I mean, the undercard in general being really good. I wanted to see that thing top to bottom, so I was interested. Maybe, there wasn't as much interest in the main event as there was for the rematch, but still, there was intrigue. I think people wanted to see, was this going to be some sort of car crash TV? Would Fury repeat and batter Wilder, beat the delusion out of him? Or would Deontay Wilder, with some of the stuff that he's been saying, rise up and use that sort of delusion that's been fueling him to get a victory? There were some interesting storylines there. I don't think it was going to do as well, and I don't think the third fight will do as well on pay-per-view, but I still think there's a lot of people interested in that fight, and especially because the undercard was good. Adrian says, big up yourself, Boxing Squared from New Zealand to St. Lucia. Keep the videos coming. I'll try. Sometimes it could be a little bit of a struggle with, balancing work and, running the channel, but try to get up at least 4 or 5 videos a week if I can, more if I'm able. Time says many people won't see it. Top and Time says it's a good show with Fury, Bob, and ESPN, so they want maximum money from it. Delaying it 3 months to try to get a couple more $1 million in the door. I mean, I'm not sure does a delay drive ticket sales anymore. That's the thing. I mean, what else can they do between now and then to try to reinvigorate interest in this fight? It kind of is where it is, from my perspective. Unga says, thoughts on the Mihai Nestor Colby Madison firefight. Really fun fight, if nothing else. I thought that was on the main card, which I thought was starting at 1 o'clock, so clearly I have missed that. It's probably going to be on DAZN, so I will look to go and catch that on the YouTube channel. So if I've missed that, I will be going back to watch it. But Mihai Nestor, he's a good, talented prospect, but just too inactive. I'm not sure Golden Boy's really serving his interest right now, but sounds like it was a fun fight. Thank you, Unga, for bringing that up. So Top and Time says, like Shelley and Bob lied to him that Fury's camp was fully vaccinated. Well, I can't speak about who said what to, about vaccinations, but, even if you are still fully vaccinated, you can still catch it. That's the thing. I mean, it's a myth to say if you're fully vaccinated, you can't get COVID-19, because people can. It's just that the vaccination can limit, how severe it is. But you can still catch it, and you can still transmit the virus even if vaccinated. Adrian says, the boxing schedule of PBC and ESPN needed to find a free spot for both as well. Yeah, that's a good point for what's coming up. They've got to slot in with other events, avoid other big sports because they want to sort of put the best foot forward, try to capture their own little piece of attention for the pay-per-view. Ben says, biggest shame is the loss of the undercard. Yeah, I agree with that. IMPK says, I noticed that 16 days out from the fight that the pay-per-view price had not been announced. I am not convinced that this fight date was ever that solid. Well, I think it was, but I mean, there was also the other peripheral issue. There was no UK broadcaster as of a few days ago, so that in itself was an interesting talking point, given Tyson Fury was the belt holder and from the UK, that either Sky or BT hadn't sort of picked it up. Maybe that was happening in the background and just hadn't been announced, but generally, weeks, if not a couple of months out, that would be sort of squared away. So Tara says, my uncle Jacob recently petitioned to become a boxer. I said petitioned because he is suffering from vascular Parkinson's disease. Late stage, by the way. Okay. Ben says that Shelley Finkel couldn't get off the phone soon enough in his interview with Boxing Social. Very candid about the September deadline for the contract. Well, that's the other thing that's sort of floating around here. The arbitrator had set a date of September the 15th for the third fight to be held. So, I mean, I guess maybe they'll work something out. Maybe Shelley Finkel and that will try to hold them to it. Maybe they will try to get Tyson Fury stripped if they can't manage to get the fight done by the date that the arbitrator did set down. I mean, given there's been all sorts of contract shenanigans and whatnot, who's to say that they're not going to look for blood given this postponement? Top and Time says, I would have loved to have seen Sanchez Ajagba. Disappointing. Blue Cheese No Fleece, great name there. No one wants to see this, just stick a fork in it already. Well, unfortunately, it seems that, regardless of the people who don't want to see the fight's going to go ahead by the looks of it. And with the contracts involved, and I don't think the WBC is going to step in, they will just sort of see where this all sort of plays out. I don't see them stepping in to order a Dillian White fight or anything like that. They don't want to risk getting taken to court. Jonathan says, if it goes past September 15, will the contract for the third fight still stand? Interest agree that it can be pushed to a certain date. Well, maybe that point becomes moot, but I guess we're just sort of spectators waiting to see what happens. So Wayne says, Boxing Squared for boxing news and views 100. Tara says, have you got any form of advice for my uncle? I can't say that I do. Jay says, what do you think about Hergovic's situation? Well, I did a video the other day on that, so do check that out. It's a shame that they can't seem to get anyone to face him. And I don't think it's a situation that he's some sort of boogeyman that no one wants to face. It's mostly about money. No one wants to take short money to jump in against a prospect who's very talented but doesn't have a massive fan base and doesn't bring massive money to the table. If he was a real star in the sort of sense that he brought eyeballs and money, someone would have jumped at it for, $1 million payday or something like that. But like Hunter dipped out for 360 grand to go elsewhere to Triller, I mean, people are looking at it going, is that the sort of money I can expect? And if I take this fight, it's risky and I lose, it's a couple-year rebuild. I would note, though, that the situation with Martin Piccoli, who was 15th in the rankings, I've been looking to see what Billy Nelson would say on Twitter about, the whole situation, about, effectively turning it down and wanting a tune-up and all that, but just very quiet, which is unlike him. So, I mean, Eddie Hearn really did sort of hang them out to dry there in terms of his comments. BG says there's rumour of Tyson getting knocked down in sparring by Jared Anderson. Well, that wouldn't surprise me at all. Jared Anderson is a very good fighter, and he is sort of, part of the future of the heavyweight division. In a few years, Jared Anderson will be a guy vying for titles, and he's going to be a champion at some point. I actually just saw, as an aside, that Arslanbek Makhmedov is sparring with Adam Kovnatsky and also Joey DeVaco. And I did sort of wonder, if he's dropped any of them. It's a business, the tests can be faked, people can be brought, it all makes sense. Wilder will win the third, it's politics. Well, all this sort of stuff will eventually play out in the ring. I mean, if it is something that's been manufactured to not happen now, I mean, I don't know either way, but the fight seemingly is going to happen, so at some point it will be settled in the ring. Well, hopefully. I mean, if this sort of drags into some sort of court case or whatever else, and it gets messy, well, that'll be disappointing, because as I say, it's been a lean year for boxing, the heavyweight division in general so far. Toppentine says Bob has disappointed boxing the second time in 2 months. Mr. Ed MVP says Fury pulling out of a fight, what a shock, amazing, he has so many kids as good as he is at pulling out. Wayne says, I think it's ticket sales and Fury's rough sparring. He's got 2 good fighters in there and to disrupt the Wilder camp. Well, I mean, there could be some of these points that people are raising, but at this point it's only speculation. Some of this, as someone said earlier on, that effectively we can only take it at face value. But it's not surprising to me that in a world where we're in a pandemic with COVID-19, that COVID-19 could actually disrupt the fight. And especially where it has been rampant in the United States. Not a surprise to me at all that, a fight has been cancelled. Adrian says it's bad management on Shelley's part to take Bob's word about the vaccinations. Kind of like it was, the whole sort of situation where Bob was feeding stuff to Eddie Hearn when they were negotiating Undisputed, saying arbitration, no issue. I mean, you can't really take Bob's word at face value all of the time. Simple Boy says, has anyone here Eubank's son passed away? I hadn't heard that. You mean the not obviously Chris Eubank, but the other one who boxed for a bit, or another son? I don't know how many children he's got. Amber says, hey, loved your work, BS. I'm a New Zealand Patreon supporter and I've been hanging out for you to put an AJ versus Usyk video. Anything in the pipeline? Yeah, there will be. Actually, what I will say about this whole Fury and Wilder 3 being delayed, there was a tiny silver lining for me, because generally what I like to do with my preview coverage is a month out or so do a 10 things to watch for video, and the different guys, who they're sparring, and different videos like that. But because I've been busy, there's been a bit of boxing on and other bits and pieces, it's just those videos take more time. Hadn't got to it, so that was stuff I was going to be working on this weekend. So the fact it's been pushed out a couple of months gives me a little bit more breathing space, and the silver lining is I won't just have 2 weeks for those videos to be up. But I probably won't do them this weekend. I'll just procrastinate a little bit more. Unga says, does own YouTube channel prepare for a shock? So that's the Nista fight. Okay, that is interesting. So we've just got a super chat that's just been dropped from Nadeem. Thank you very much for that. So Nadeem, formerly MBT Boxing, was one of my very first Patreon supporters. And so he was there for the best part of 18 months. And he had a great live stream sort of thing that he used to do on his channel. Very entertaining. It's a shame, I got to say, MBT, that you don't do them anymore, because they were entertaining, gave me a lot of good content to work with and a lot of good sort of funny videos to produce and put up on Twitter. But thank you for that super chat. I appreciate it. So L-Dog says, Boxing Squared, Hergovic said to media today that his next fight is August 28th in the States. Wallin and McKean are the names he listed. McKean is saying on Instagram he has a big fight coming up. Well, if it is Hergovic versus McKean, I think that Hergovic will start the favourite for obvious reasons. I mean, McKean has sort of, at the sort of Oceania level, proven that, there's not too many other guys at the moment that sort of can compete with him. But that's a very different sort of step to stepping up to where Filip Hergovic, sort of skill set, a fighter like him. And yeah, Hearn had said August the 28th, maybe a date Filip Hergovic was coming back. But he said if they couldn't get anyone in the IBF, they may just have to get him in with a fight with anyone just to give him some activity. So I will definitely be looking for that and possibly doing a video on that. I guess in the next couple of days, maybe a bit more news will shake down on that. But yeah, Hergovic has been waiting and watching for quite a while now. He hasn't really, this will be his first fight, the 28th of August, if it is confirmed, for the year. Phil says, come on, recycle fight, truth be known. Fire Rises says, Deontay Wilder poisoned Tyson Fury's water with COVID. Tabula says, Deontay shouldn't fight at bridgerweight, he should fight at egg weight. Waylo says, I don't believe a word that comes out from either camp. Well, I guess all we do know for certain is that the fight is not happening on July the 24th. Force Ghost Fabio says Wilder should fight Trevor Bryan to take the WBA title. Big Plans Little Drive says, commenting to someone else there. Fire Riser says, hey Wilder fans, love your excuses, COVID, egg weights. Aaron says that Fury should show up, prove of his positive test. As fans, we deserve it. I'm trying to get a refund on my ticket and hotel. I guess that's the, it's not just the ticket, is it? That if you've booked accommodation, it's a bit harder to, so it's a shame for people who were invested in physically going to that fight because, obviously now you've got to sort of fight a rearguard action to either get a credit for your hotel or a full refund. Crazy D3 says, is the undercard postponed as well? Shame that their careers get pushed back as well. Yeah, well, as I understand it, the card's not going ahead, so the undercard, it's not sort of going ahead on the same night with another main event. Plus as well, I mean, you've got, F.A.O. Jugba and Jared Anderson who've been in camp with Tyson Fury, sparring Tyson Fury. So, these are guys who could well be affected as well by this whole thing, although they haven't been named as people with COVID, but they are close contacts and probably will be tested, all that sort of stuff. Unga says, L-Dog makes perfect sense. Always thought it was strange why a Wallin or McKean fight wouldn't jump at that fight. Well, this is the thing I was talking to a friend on Twitter by direct message the other day, that for Dempsey McKean, even if he got the same level of money as Michael Hunter, which was 360 grand US, that would be a career high payday and possibly the highest sort of payday that would be on offer anywhere for Dempsey McKean. So you would think he would want to jump in it. In terms of Otto Wallin, he's a guy that you would think without other opportunities, because he's promoted by Dimitri Salita, who's sort of tier 2 type promoter, doesn't have a TV deal, works with all number of promoters, but that sort of fight, he might fancy that he can box with Hergovic and maybe sort of finesse his way to a decision. I actually don't mind that fight. I think Hergovic and Wallin is a good fight and probably the best name on Hergovic's record and a decent test at this point, although Hergovic, I think, would win that fight. Unga says Hergovic versus Bacoli would be good in 2021, in my opinion. Fire Riser says Wilder is a lying bum. He did this to himself. Okay. Aaron says Fury, Warren, and Arum should let Wilder take an interim fight before. It's only fair. With this amount of time out of the ring, that might actually be helpful for Deontay Wilder, but with the contract sort of locked in that they're fighting each other next, I'm not sure either side would allow the other to take some sort of interim step, even if one was available. And if it is only 3 months away, I don't know. I mean, I think what we saw after Deontay Wilder fought Luis Ortiz, then he fought Tyson Fury, and 3 months later in 2020. Later, it was sort of spoken about that gap, for Deontay Wilder, who generally that was the smallest gap in his career for a few years, that they didn't really want to repeat that going forward. So I'm not sure if they'd want to take it as well. L-Dog says, Boxing Squared, have you thought about making channel memberships? I have, and I'm now eligible for it now that I'm over 30,000 subscribers, but I have Patreon, so that's, it's been one of these things because of the pandemic. The boxing's been a bit all over the show. There's been a lot less boxing in general in the past sort of just over a year. The quality of boxing hasn't been as good. And it just feels like boxing, especially heavyweight boxing, hasn't quite found its feet and got back to pre-pandemic levels. And one, because I've got Patreon, so people can sign up to there, they can get extra content, and generally I'll do sort of try to do more sort of thought pieces, bits and pieces that a bit more timeless. But if I was to create channel memberships for the YouTube channel, would I be duplicating some of that? So yeah, I'm still thinking about that. And because I've been on the sort of work that I've been doing has been pretty hardcore for the since the start of this year. I don't want to sort of stretch myself thin by trying to sort of do all bits and pieces across different sort of platforms and mediums and that sort of stuff. And that's part of the reason I never sort of started an Instagram account, for example, because once you start some of that stuff and you want it to keep it up, and it's quite a bit of time and effort to invest to that sort of stuff, and I'd rather try to keep up things at a good level here on the channel, Patreon, and obviously I sort of active on Twitter, not as much obviously as here, but I'll post little bits of news, and when there's fights I'll tweet out in bits and pieces. But I have thought about it, but yeah, it's one of those things for maybe when things sort of improve, we get a bit more of a heavyweight schedule where you actually got a number of fights in the next sort of number of months. Because when you look ahead, what have we got? I mean, you can name a couple of fights, but it's not like it's just laden with good fight after good fight, because a lot of stuff is just up in the air, TBA. So Ungus says, 2-0, Seb Eubank passed away in Dubai, son and brother of senior and junior. Well, that is a shame. So yeah, sympathies to the Eubank family, and as Luke says, RIP Seb. 5557 says, did something happen with the fight? Where have you been, mate? It's so it's been postponed because of sort of COVID-19 in the Fury camp. So that's been sort of all over the place. That was announced about a day ago. Part of the reason for doing this live stream, I couldn't get to it when it happened because of work, all that sort of stuff. So Right Hook Boxing is in the building. He says, just popping in before I sleep for a decade. Hope you're well, pal. I hope you're well too. Aaron White says, Fury the fraud. Everyone in the US is laughing at this guy. Left Hook Bully says Hergovic will put a spanking on McKean. I certainly think that Hergovic versus McKean is more one-sided than Hergovic versus Wallin. But I mean, McKean, or actually both of them, McKean and Wallin, both southpaws. So interesting style matchup for Hergovic to sort of, solve there in terms of the fight. I'll just have a little bit of water, just a second. So Fire Riser says, in the UK, Fury back with the WBC belt. We don't give a crap about you. 5557 says, not true. Most of the USA is embarrassed of Wilder. L-Dog says, I find it absolutely comical. You still see people saying justice for Ortiz. Ortiz is the boogeyman when Ortiz refused to fight Hergovic. Well, that's according to Eddie Hearn that he turned it down. But I'm not surprised. I mean, and it goes back to some of the sort of stuff around Charles Martin and Dillian White. Seems to be people forget almost immediately, because they want these sort of fights to get made, that promotional issues are an issue. I mean, if I can't see the PBC farming out any top fighter to Eddie Hearn to fight on DAZN, unless it was like an Andy Ruiz, Anthony Joshua type situation, which you can't just cite as, hey, this is their willingness to send fighters across, because that was for 3 belts and several $1 million. That was a free hit at a title. It's a bit different with some of these other things. They're not looking to help Eddie Hearn build his brand in the US. And arguably, Ruiz winning that fight against Joshua, it set Joshua's US ambitions and career and profile back, and probably to an extent Eddie Hearn's sort of push in the United States market. Tripp says, I pray Wilder fights White now, but there's about the 12% chance of that. I actually think the chance is probably 0. Charlie says there would be nearly 2 years out of the Ring of Fury vs Wilder fights in October. Can't see Fury fighting Wilder next now. Maybe he will drop the belt. Well, Tyson Fury's unpredictable, but I don't know if I see him dropping the belt. I mean, maybe lawyers will get involved at some point. Who knows? Nadeem says, right hook boxing. Hope you're well, bud. Sup, L-Dog. Hergovic. Brandon says, my suit. Brandon again says it was the gloves. Blame the floppy gloves, says Fire Rises. Okay, so they're talking about Deontay Wilder there. I'll just try to scroll down and catch. I've fallen way behind here on the chat, so I'll just try to just catch up a little bit. Michael says, I'm from Alabama and I used to love Wilder, but I've become a huge Fury fan. There is so much bias against him in the UK too. In my opinion, love your channel. Thank you for stopping by, Michael. I appreciate it. L-Dog says, Otto Wallin is associated with the PBC. Wouldn't shock me if he fights Michael Polite Coffee. Well, he's associated with the PBC in the sense that Dimitri Salita, his promoter, will work with anyone. So, I mean, just like Jermaine Franklin is also a Salita fighter, and he seems to be in the running for a fight with Dillian White. So if the money's there and the offer's right, he will farm his fighters out anywhere. And part of the reason, because an Otto Wallin fight with Dillian White has been sort of discussed before, and my sort of thinking on that is, coming off that Tyson Fury performance where he lost but put up a decent effort in a losing effort, they were pricing him out, asking for too much for fights that people were like, well, you lost that fight. We don't want to give you all this sort of money. But yeah, Otto Wallin and Filip Hergovic, I wouldn't mind it. Liam says, Hearn talking about bringing White to Australia to fight Dempsey McKean. Okay. Well, that's interesting news to me, but yeah, I mean, McKean's, obviously been fighting out of Australia. He's not tied up with any of the big promoters overseas. So, I mean, it's a possibility, but I mean, it's kind of like when all the promoters were talking about bringing fights to New Zealand and Australia during parts of the pandemic, and none of that ever panned out. So maybe it sounds good, but what's the reality? So Right Hook Boxing says, hit the like, guys. Yes, please. That'd be much appreciated. So 77 in the building, wherever you are, morning, noon or night. Thank you for joining me here. So we're 11 o'clock in the morning here. Not sure where you are, but it might be either late afternoon somewhere or evening or very early morning. So thank you for joining me once again. Forsco's Fabio says, I appreciate all the content you can provide us. Boxing Squared. Dream matchup is Tom Schwarz versus Christopher Lovejoy. And actually, a little bit of Tom Schwarz news. So I was sent a little article because I'm not sure if a lot of people are aware, but about a year or so ago, he was accused of punching a woman, apparently breaking her jaw, and there is a court case and that sort of stuff. So his promoter, SES Boxing, has effectively, until that's all resolved, dropped him. So they're not fighting him on any bills or anything, but he is returning in a couple of months in some journeyman level fight. So this is obviously, off his own bat, not promoted by SES Boxing, but it did make me wonder, is he being cut completely from them, or is this outside of his contract, or is he in breach of his contract? But yeah, but the article also mentioned that he only got a couple of $100,000 for that fight against Tyson Fury, which, according to reports at the time, had suggested it was about 1 million US, but the reporting in the German media suggested it was just 200,000 euros, I think it was. So what's that? $300,000 to $300,000? I don't know. Something, whatever the exchange rate. Crazy D3 says, is White vs Martin realistic? The pre-fight trash talk will be fun. Or even in this pre-fight trash talk that we've had on Instagram. It's been great. I've enjoyed it. But I just don't think it's going to get made. And Dillian White has already hinted in a post that a fight is coming. And Martin responded in the comments basically saying, I knew that you'd be sort of, words to this effect, dragging things out before I give you an ass beating. Effectively saying, I'm not next, but I still want to fight you, I want to beat you up, all that sort of stuff. I mean, it seemingly is going to be Jermaine Franklin, but we shall see. But I think Martin, and as I say, the promotional issues around this matter. I mean, Martin, all his recent fights since he lost to Anthony Joshua have all been on PBC cards. He's a PBC fighter. Is Al Heyman in the business of sending out fighters to other stables to help build those stables and put good fights on other broadcasters' networks? No. So, I mean, to me, the talk of that is just that, talk. Martin would have to be completely out of a management contract and, you know, be a complete free agent in every sense of the word for that fight to happen on DAZN. If Fury vacated, would White be made full champion? Well, he's the interim champion, so possibly. Fury says, Martin is a bum, Dillian wants Wilder. Luke says, fingers crossed for a double knockout, absolutely sick of these guys stalling the division. Well, actually, I did a video on this on Patreon just a little while ago, sort of talking about the sort of plight of the guys who were from the sort of 2016, 2017 turning pro. The Olympians and guys like a Daniel Dubois, that's sort of that ilk. After, you know, that turned pro effectively 4 or 5 years ago now, they have been sort of like a Hergovic, for example, and he was part of the example that I used, and Tony Yoka. You know, some of these guys are knocking on the door of 30 years old now, but they're, you know, just can't quite cut through. And when you consider guys like Joshua, within 3 or 4 years had a title. You know, some of these guys from previous sort of, you know, because like generations of heavyweights, this current generation that's trying to crack through just hasn't been able to get the opportunities because the top end of the division has been stalled for about 3 years. You've had, you know, 2, 3, 4 fighters effectively fighting amongst themselves or holding it up, and it feels like we're not getting regeneration and that things are just sort of stalled out to some extent. And it's a shame for those guys who want those big fights. But in the meantime, and part of the problem is these guys only fight once or twice a year. How can the division ever progress when you've got these guys holding all the chips but fighting so infrequently? It is maddening. Trip says, Squared, what prospect do you think would have the best chance at winning a title now? I would say Bakadir Jalalov. I still think because he's 26 years old, so he's a top medal prospect at the Olympics. I really like Bakadir Jalalov, and if you don't know who he is, I did do in the lockdown period in March or April 2020 a video on him. He's going to be a very good heavyweight, but I still think he's a couple of years away from being fully developed. So I don't expect he's going to be making too much noise really until 2 or 3 years time. But of the current prospects that have sort of, the guys that I was just sort of referencing, you've got Hergovic, Yoka, Joe Joyce, that crew that was all coming through at the same time from the Olympics. There's other guys to throw in there as well that sort of turned over roughly the same time. Aslanbek Makhmadov, F.A. Jagba was an Olympian as well. One of those guys is going to win a title at some point, but it does feel, if they can get an opportunity, and that's half the problem right now. You've got this sort of stalled out, this sort of pyramid type structure, a couple of boxes at the top effectively controlling everything, and they're all building in rematch clauses galore. Ali says Tyrone Spong would have hurt Wilder and Joshua. At this point, Tyrone Spong is just not really a factor in the division. So, he had that failed test ahead of what would have been an Usyk fight. And that was a shame for him. And I know that it was tried to be finessed in terms of he put results up for other earlier tests. But, why is he not fighting? Is it because he is banned or what? Why hasn't he ever sort of made that step through, signed with a bigger promoter? Or, I don't know, it's just sort of seemed like the last few years of his career. Because he fought Yatalo Pereira. I'm just trying to remember what was his last name. But anyway, that guy. And from there, it's just been completely downhill. Just hasn't been really cited since. Crazy D3 says, wouldn't White versus Wallin make more sense than White versus Franklin? Surely beating Wallin would be more credible given Wallin's performance against Fury in Brazil. Well, I think the thing that they're trying to go for, I think there's a couple of things going on there. So Otto Wallin obviously is living and fighting in the United States, but he's not American. He's obviously from Sweden. They're trying to seemingly get White to face some Americans. But White has clearly stated he wants to fight at a certain level for his next fight. Franklin is below the level that he had been fighting at. Excuse me just for a sec. Have a little bit of water. You can kind of... I thought the live stream had been going for about 40 minutes. It's 23 minutes. Okay, unless it started again. I think there was some sort of dropout earlier. But yeah, Otto Wallin... Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's a good fight and a good, that's maybe a bad style matchup for Dillian White. I think Jermaine Franklin is a bit more, in terms of what White had been looking for, that's the sort of guy. And when he said he wanted to face an American in America and wanted it to be a bit of a step down from where he'd been fighting, that's why I thought a guy like Franklin sort of fit the bill entirely. And Franklin's not a big puncher, so there's less risk with, not that Otto Wallin is a big puncher, but stylistically I think Dillian White is going to have a lot easier time with Jermaine Franklin, and he'll win that fight, probably get a devastating knockout. So Ali says Tyrone Spong is the guy that your favorite heavyweight ducks. Tyrone Spong is a former kickboxer who's done nothing in the heavyweight division. He's not being ducked because he's just simply not relevant. That's, the fact of it. Jason says, I just joined the live, so I don't know if this has been mentioned, but did you catch the Nistor fight BS, and where do you think his level is at? No, I was going live here. I actually thought it was on the main broadcast, which DAZN, on the app when I logged in half an hour ago, whatever, told me it was starting at 1 o'clock. So I thought, okay, well, I'll just catch it then. But if it's on the YouTube channel, I will be going into that to watch it after this live. So Michael says, RIP Sebastian Eubank, found drowned in Dubai, thoughts with family and friends. Yeah, that is terrible. So Ali says, no one on the top wants to fight him. They don't want to pay him good money. He hasn't done anything so far. How can you get good money if you haven't proven yourself at any real level in the heavyweight division? He's proven himself in another discipline, but that's another discipline. Lover's Lane for me says Heard Fury retired. What? Legendary says this is why Interim exists. Why shouldn't White replace Fury? Well, I think because of everything that's gone on with the trilogy. This was locked and loaded and signed. The arbitration forced it. I just don't think it's going to be viable. I don't think it's going to happen. Just because of those reasons. And if WBC tries to jump in, well, they're probably going to find themselves as part of some sort of court action. They don't want to get involved in that. And plus, they'd rather have extra belts, like the WBA. They want to have as many belts as possible, generate as many sanctioning fees as possible. This is why we're seeing more belts being created, because there's been fewer fights, so they want more belts for more money. Crazy D3 says Tyrone Spong needs to stop hanging out with Big Pharmacy Miller. Interesting. So I'll take final thoughts and comments. Drop a comment and we'll get to it in the next 5 minutes or so. I think there must have been a dropout at some point, because I swear that I've been live for longer than 26 minutes. That just feels like it's been way longer than that. So Tabula says, why not Dillian White versus Hunter? If they look for an American, Hunter used to be promoted by Hearn, so negotiations should be easier. Well, Hunter is signed with Triller. He's got a fight coming up with Mike Wilson, so that is going to be next month. So that's just not on the table. So he's promoted now and been fighting for Triller. He's got 2 fights on that deal. Joe says Fury is a real gypsy. Joe says Canelo is still the king of boxing. Octavia says, why Fury making up a lot of excuses? Just fight the man. You knocked him out once. You should be able to do it again easily. Well, if he's got COVID-19, well, it'd be silly to fight him now. It's kind of like when they were going to first make the trilogy last year, Deontay Wilder was injured. He injured himself in that second fight, had to have surgery. They initially were looking at July 2020. Would you say the same thing, that Wilder should have just got over it and just fought him when he was still injured? It's that same argument. If you're a high-performing athlete and you've got something like COVID-19, you can't just sort of, brush it off and go, oh yeah, I'll just jump in the ring. that would be absolutely, silly to do that. So, yeah. Fire Riser says, Boxing Squared, what's your view to all the Wilder lies and allegations of cheating? Well, all these conspiracies about the gloves, the people that are peddling these excuses can't make their mind up what it was. Was the padding taken out, or were there egg weights in there? Because clearly it can't be both. And people peddling look at these gloves, they're depressed, you can see his knuckles. Well, where was the egg weight? People can't make their mind up about what really happened. But I think it's all nonsense, and I think it is really Deontay Wilder needs these excuses, as we saw immediately after the fight. He needs this to help convince him that he didn't lose that fight, that it was taken away from him. He needs this for his own mental stability to help build him up and G him up for the third fight. And this is part of and I did a video on Patreon on this, that the sort of, Malik Scott, I know some people don't like him, but I think he is the ideal sort of guy for Deontay Wilder. He will talk him up. He will stroke his ego. He will be the yes man. He'll be everything Deontay Wilder needs him to be to build him up, to make him ready for that fight. And whether it all comes crumbling down fight night, it doesn't matter. He'll help prepare him and get him best prepared to be the best version of himself for that fight. And so it might sort of seem counterintuitive, but I think Malik Scott, with what he's doing, is going to work well for what Deontay Wilder needs and the sort of, the mental mind frame that he's in. So Joe says Fury has options. He don't need the belt. Real talk. Well, I guess, there is that. He could drop the belt, but I think, he'd be pillared for that. People would be criticizing him left, right, and centered. Michael says, Squared, thoughts on Mauricio Sulaiman stating White will not be mandatory? Well, he hasn't been mandatory. He won the interim title, so that's its own thing. He's considered a champion in the WBC. So at that point, he wasn't the mandatory. And, when he fought Alexander Povetkin again, it was said at the time from the WBC, there is no mandatory on the line, it's just the belt. Octavius says, sounds like excuses, friend, to me, friend. Well, I can only take this at face value that, there's a pandemic happening. COVID's been rampant in the United States. There's COVID in their camp apparently, and that's affecting him. But it's kind of like, if you got a bad flu, would you be wanting to get into one of the biggest fights of your career, in a couple of weeks? I wouldn't think so. You have to think about these things logically. Ali says, Spong, oh God, can we stop the Spong talk? Spong is actually just a non-factor in the heavyweight division. He's got to get in some fights and actually fight someone instead of just, having people. There's actually a few hardcore Tyrone Spong fans that do this around different channels, talking Spong up. The guy's not fighting. He's a non-factor. No more talk about Spong. This stream is not about Tyrone Spong and what he is or isn't doing. Joe says, who you got, England versus Italy? Well, I don't follow football, so, as crazy as that might sound to people from the UK, actually, football is not the lifeblood here, at least in my country. So, there's a lot of football fans who are interested, but, I've watched, I think, the final 10 minutes of that England versus, was it Denmark? But, yeah, I've only just been following it casually. Yeah. John says, better still, Hergovic with Matchroom is looking for a fight. Guaranteed title shot seems obvious for one, Dillian, doesn't it? Well, he's the WBC interim champion, so effectively he is already a champion. But he seems determined to go for the WBC belt, and he's really sort of thrown his lot in with them for the last couple of years. And he's had other opportunities for title eliminators and a title shot against Anthony Joshua a couple of years ago. So he's made choices for his career. He's got to live with them. But he won't fight Hergovic because it's not very good money. Let's just face it, Dillian White's a money fighter. He's made his career around fighting for purses rather than necessarily prestige within, for final eliminators, etc. DJN says, now they're saying Fury used palm shots, which may actually be true, but a lot of fighters do it, including Wilder. Jackson says, thoughts on Fraser Clark's potential level when he turns over. I kind of think that it might be that he's left his run a little bit too late, Maybe it's like Joe Joyce and the fact that he's turning pro quite late, but I'm not sure that he's got some of those attributes that could still make Joyce an effective fighter even into, his later 30s. Because people forget, Joe Joyce is soon to be 36. So, yeah, I mean, Joe Joyce, yeah. Fraser Clark, I should say, I think he's a good amateur. I'm not so sure how far he can go as a pro, though. Ali says Hergovic and Spong train at the same gym, but big promoters are ducking him, or they don't want to sign him because of his age. Age is just a number. Or it might be the fact that he's, being popped for performance-enhancing drugs. You ever thought of that too? Faluso82 says Fury vs Wilder will never happen. Fury will find a way out of this fight. Fire says Fury ignoring that, lying him, but Dillian fight him. Joe says, I can't believe a Brit is destroying the boxing game. Respect to Fury. BG London says, you're a rugby fan. I am, but I mean, I would say that for my whole life I've been a sports fan, but because I follow boxing so closely now, and I wouldn't say I'm forced to follow it more closely than I used to, but having a channel takes up so much time. I'm probably not as big a sporting fan for other sports as I used to be, because more of my time is dedicated to boxing, if that makes sense. Any countries that call it soccer aren't big fans of football. Isn't it called the Socceroos in Australia? I'm pretty sure it is. Ali says, we don't see White talking about Wilder since Fury pulled out. He's a plastic gangster. Well, his promoter has been talking about trying to make that fight. Jackson says, in a fantasy matchup between Joseph Parker and David Tua, who would you favour? David Tua. So Jackson says, I would have said Parker, but he's looked shaky in early rounds against Chisora, so maybe Tua would get to him. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's a case of that. I mean, and there are fighters like this that perhaps Joseph Parker, his prime has been and gone. That actually he's been, on the decline, because I think in the last couple of years we haven't seen much from him. He's got a chronic injury for both of his elbows. He didn't look good against Derek Chisora, who's a guy who's a gatekeeper to the world level. And arguably, a lot of people think that Chisora won that fight. There are opportunities that Parker could have had to really put it on him, and he didn't. I mean, I think Prime Tua versus Prime Parker, I would pick Prime Tua. TopHeavyweights.com says, how far do you think Fabio Wardley can go? It's an interesting question, because some fights he's looked really good, really slick, but then in others, like the Molina one, he didn't look good. And I think he wants to showcase himself, but he's just got to go in and do a job, as opposed to sort of showboating and preening. Stephen said, Boxing Squid about to change weight classes. Fire Riser says, settle down Aussie, you bum barbecues. Okay, not sure what that's about. Unga says, All Blacks Fiji, who you got? Is that a legitimate question? Journeyman says, what up Boxing Squid? Hello to you too. Ali says, Boxing Squid, are you especially a heavyweight podcast channel? Yeah, exclusively. Stephen says, so sick of White's smoke and mirrors. I mean, it is one of these things he does sort of talk the talk, but if he is going to fight a Jermaine Franklin, there will be some blowback. Even though he sort of, spelled it out and said it straight early, after that last fight, he wants an easier touch. He wants to fight in America and against a lower level opponent. Some people will not give him a dispensation for that. Joe says, and Canelo's famous in your country. I mean, boxing fans know who he is, but I'm not sure that people more broadly do. Maybe I think people who follow sports will be broadly aware of the name. Maybe you've seen the odd highlights on the news. It's that sort of situation. If he fights, there might be a short clip on the news, something like that. But he's not a household name by any stretch. But boxing fans certainly do know who he is. But I mean, I would say, and I'm sure this would be backed up by other New Zealanders who might be on this podcast listening here. Live stream. Yeah, I mean, boxing is a super niche sport. Most people really don't follow it to any extent in New Zealand at all. especially since, I mean, there was an uptick in support for boxing and following boxing because of Joseph Parker, but he's kind of been, off the radar a little bit for those couple of years where he had tune-ups, wasn't up to much, and after he lost, I mean, New Zealanders love a winner, so after he sort of had those couple of back-to-back losses, his sort of profile sort of dipped and wasn't helped by those tune-ups. So he's not as big a star as he once was, and I think as a result, not as many people are sort of maybe following him or boxing more broadly. But yeah, I mean, if you were to ask people on the street, just a random 100 people, who's the heavyweight champion, guarantee you're still going to get some people saying Mike Tyson, just because they have no idea who's fighting anymore. Or they might say, oh, is it Joseph Parker? So Fire says, check White's Twitter, he threatens Wilder, laughs at him, and Wilder does nothing. Ali says, I like it, man, you only talk about the heavyweight division. And just on Tyrone Spong, he can fight, but, he needs to be fighting some guys to make himself relevant again, because he hasn't been in the last couple of years. I know you're a big fan, but, you can't just sort of, yell into the wind and say people are ducking you. You've got to make things happen rather than expecting them to happen. Nadeem says, yeah, we call it soccer too. Not a big sport here either. There's a Wellington team in our National League, the Wellington Phoenix, who occasionally I go see a Phoenix game. But, their games are in winter, so obviously it's freezing. I don't mind going out when there's an All Blacks Test match at the stadium here in in Wellington, but that's like once or twice a year. I don't like going out to icy cold venues and getting blasted. I'd rather watch that stuff on TV. So I'll do it once or twice for an All Blacks game, like this one coming up end of August, where I'll be going to that. But yeah, I prefer to going to, say, the cricket in the summer because it's nice and warm, 2020, that sort of stuff. But anyway, I digress. So I'll just get to some final comments here. Journeyman says, what are your thoughts on this Jared Anderson fella? I think he will be a future world champion. I mean, out of all the Americans coming through, I'm the most highest on him. I think he's got a very big future. Blue Cheese No Fleas says, is there no public appeal for Wilder Fury and the networks won't benefit and lose money? Then what's the point if people won't benefit financially? This will not overturn the contract. I mean, I'm sure that the networks, they want to make as much money as possible. They don't want to take a bath on this at all. So, I mean, if there's this extra couple of months, maybe it will help with promotion, but I wouldn't have thought so. Joe says, I always thought once were warriors when I hit New Zealand. People either think that or Lord of the Rings, all that sort of stuff. Fire Riser says the undercard should go ahead. Good fights. Actually, that card, the undercard could just be a card of its own. Joe says, Jinsey says, what a mess. Fury did the same thing to Klitschko, just boycott pay-per-view until they give us what they want. Well, Fury does have a history of pulling out of fights. You can't deny that. BG London says, the Juggernaut's still fighting on July the 24th. Silver lining, I guess. Well, it's pretty much the only decent fight left in the month. There's not really a lot doing in the heavyweight division. But, the second-tier type fight. I mean, if Takam was 5 or 6 years younger, fight. But Joe Joyce versus 40-year-old Carlos Takam. I mean, Takam will talk it up and, try to sell it as best he can that he's still a force. But, he's not in my top 20. I mean, he's a top 25, top 30 heavyweight at this point. Topheavyweights.com. So if you haven't followed his page, do so. So that is website. Strong undercard of Fury Wilder 3 could have worked on Fox TV and sold tickets. Yeah, I think that would have had to, potentially they'd have to have Kovnatsky and Helenius topping the bill. Could have had it at the Barclays Centre again. That would have done well. It would have done well. Could have easily been its own card, but it wasn't pay-per-view worthy. And the thing that would have helped to get those guys paid was the pay-per-view, because I don't think on its own it would have worked as pay-per-view. Jackson says, do you think we could see African fighters making a big splash in boxing like they're doing in the UFC? Well, there's the potential for it, but obviously I think, you need to get, it's like anywhere.